Welcome everyone to the fifth session of Unplugged sessions, where we meet creative industry professionals from week to week. I'm Christopher Buttigieg, your host, and today I'm very excited to have with me Paul Burns, Head of Dance at Creative Scotland. In short, Creative Scotland is the public body that supports the arts and screen and creative industries across all parts of Scotland, on behalf of everyone who lives, works, and visits. Thanks for taking the time, Paul, today to join us. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, yes.
Just before we start, Paul, can you give us a very brief introduction about you and what your career involves?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the kind of potted history of Paul Burns. So I grew up in South Wales in a Scottish family, but my mum and dad moved down to Wales, so that's where I grew up, and was always kind of very into music as a young person, and sort of studied music at local school I went to, comprehensive school I went to, and thought for a while I was gonna kind of pursue that as a career, but as I got a bit older and experienced kind of more of the kind of arts world, I decided that what I really was interested in is working with people who are really good at what they did, rather than being kind of okay at what I did. So I decided to go to university to do history of art, and just about scraped in. I didn't do terribly well in my exams, but I got in the end. So I did a history of art degree, and then when I came out, I did a few different jobs, and then kind of ended up working in sort of arts development. So working with artists and around kind of funding and artist development for a local authority, and then for what became Arts Council England in Birmingham. But was kind of regional arts body at the time. And from there, I met a guy who was running a record shop and was wanting to kind of branch out into sort of music education work. So I went to work with him for a while, which was a really interesting time. We were doing kind of music education and producing kind of shows with artists on one side of the business, and the other side of the business is kind of commercial music. So putting on these big kind of hip hop and grime music events. So that was a kind of crazy time. And towards the end of that time, I was working more and more with dance. And after I left that company, I went freelance and was working as a producer with a number of artists, both music and dance, but moving more into dance. And then I was lucky enough to start working for a company called Dance Exchange in Birmingham that have a theatre and develop and produce work with dance artists. And I went on to work there for 7 years, programming the theatre, producing all the productions that they worked on, and managing International Dance Festival Birmingham, which was the big kind of one of the biggest dance festivals in Europe at the time. It happened every 2 years and over a kind of 4-week period. So I worked with hundreds of different dance companies for that period. And then after when I left, I decided to leave after 4 festivals and went freelance again. And did various kind of projects, working with lots of different companies, and then did a number of kind of short-term leadership roles in different dance organisations across the country. So covering lots of maternity covers. So I worked in London for Greenwich Dance. I worked placed in London. I worked up in Leeds for Yorkshire Dance, covering the artistic director role there. And then in Nottingham as an associate director for Dance 4 in Nottingham. And it was while I was there that I saw the job in Creative Scotland. Again, it was a maternity cover initially, so I applied for that and got that. And then when the person whose maternity I was covering decided not to come back, I stayed on and now do that role permanently.
That's great. So now I kind of have a better understanding why you have all this passion and interest in working with a number of artists, but we'll speak more about that. Just before we jump into more depth, can you give me some more information about Creative Scotland, also for those who are not familiar with Creative Scotland, and what is the role of Creative Scotland in this in the arts and cultural sector over here.
And we use that funding to support the arts, screen and creative industries in three main ways, I guess. So we have funds which are kind of targeted funds that come from the Scottish Government for specific projects. So I guess one of the biggest one of those is the Youth Music Initiative, which is a big project that supports young people's music making and creative learning around music. So that's a specific pot of money that we get from the Scottish Government to develop those areas. Then we have a significant budget, again from Scottish Government, that supports our regularly funded organisations. So those are organisations that kind of form the kind of infrastructure of the arts across and screen and creative industries across Scotland. So they're supported for 3 years to develop and to deliver a programme of arts activity. And then the main way that people come into contact with us, I guess, is through our open funds, which is mainly lottery money, which supports everything from an individual artist to a big festival to deliver programmes of work or projects over a kind of fixed period. So those are the kind of main areas around funding. And then alongside that funding work, we have a kind of more general development remit. So we work with partners in Scottish Government, in other kind of organisations and funders and government bodies across Scotland and the UK to develop policy, to create new partnerships, to advocate for the arts, to advocate for more support. And that's kind of another area that's maybe a bit more hidden. But I guess the main thing I wanted to say about the way that we work at Creative Scotland is that pretty much everyone who works at Creative Scotland is from an arts background. So we're all kind of we're all people who have either worked in the sector or before. Lots of us go back to work in the sector after we leave Creative Scotland. There's lots of people who are practicing artists. So I mean, just from my desk, I can see a jeweler, I can see 2 writers. There's a couple of musicians over there. So people who have a kind of an arts practice. So we're very much kind of embedded in the culture, as we're not these kind of funders sitting up in our little kind of glass box and making decisions.
And I guess that helps you understand better the practitioners and all the people who will be applying for the funding, right?
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. I mean, just speaking of myself, I mean, I guess I now have to work with lots of different artists and producers and venues and festivals, and those are all people I've worked with from in other ways as a producer or as an artist mentor, as a venue programmer. So I guess I have that other perspective, which is really helpful when trying to kind of empathise with the particular issues that people are going through.
That's fantastic. So what does it mean to be the head of dance at Creative Scotland?
I guess, what does it mean to be the head of dance at Creative Scotland? I guess what inspired me to apply for the job was just the sense that I could get that slightly bigger picture. I mean, as I say, I've been inspired to want to work with artists over the course of my career and to create the conditions for dance artists and the dance sector to be supported better across my career. But usually that's been in very particular places or in very particular kind of organisations. So I guess the attractive thing about this was the opportunity to work across a whole country, and a country that's got an incredibly rich dance sector. So that was the thing that kind of really attracted me to the role. And the sense that, maybe I could make some small interventions that might make things better for those who are trying to make and present dance in the country.
It must be really satisfying, Paul, to see projects from scratch and maybe talk, because you have the chance to also speak to the people, right? When they apply for funding, you have that interaction with those who apply.
Yeah,
to finally see a project which is produced.
Yeah, it is. It can be in the best moments. It can be really inspiring, exciting to have initial conversations with someone. about a project they're thinking about, and then see maybe an application for funding when it comes in, and then see the thing in the end. But I guess our part of it is very removed from the actual delivery of the project. People, our bit is fairly straightforward, but and I guess the flip side of that is that there's way more things that we'd like to be able to support than we can support.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something we'll talk a little bit more about. But that's the frustrating bit, is that I'd like to be able to support people much more than I can.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's funding can be quite a blunt instrument. Sometimes it's kind of you either get funding or you don't, and that's really the only intervention we can make, is giving people money, and that's not always what people need. I guess that's the thing, as I say, about the background that most of us are coming from, is that I think at its best that relationship with the funder can provide so much more than funding. I think it can. I think there are lots of artists that I've been lucky enough to have a really positive relationship with, because maybe they knew me before I got this job, so maybe they understand that they can talk to me about lots of other things around that aren't just funding, and we can have a more kind of open dialogue, and I can bring some of that other experience to bear, rather than just the kind of funding bit.
And sometimes it's not just about funding. I guess there's so many other opportunities where one can actually get funding, maybe, or support. So by talking, having that understanding, probably it helps a bit more for you guys to guide people,
Yeah. Right? I mean, I think that's something I'm really passionate about, is being, I think it's really important that a dance community has, or any community, any arts community, has lots of different people involved in it. And I think as Creative Scotland, we're one of those bits, and I think at its best we're very much involved in that community, and it's an open dialogue. So that's something I really try and make possible by just going out and meeting people and being available to people as much as possible.
Yeah. Well, this is about your teammates.
Okay.
I know you already mentioned your teammates, but I'm very much interested, and also the person who actually asked the question. But what are the dynamics of your team, and what is a day at your office usually like?
Okay. Well, every day is different, especially at the moment. It's not kind of typical.
You must be really busy at the moment.
Yeah, I'm wistfully thinking about what a day in the office might be like, because it's a long time since I've had one. But yeah, it's so our team is one of the smaller teams at Creative Scotland, because dance is one of the smaller sectors, I guess. So there's 3.5 of us. So there's myself as head of dance. There's 2 dance officers, Lulu and Emily. And then there's Vanessa, who is the interdisciplinary performance officer. So she works across both dance and theatre teams, and kind of deals with the stuff that doesn't neatly fit into one of those 2 areas. So lots of the work that's maybe more contemporary performance or live art sort of work that maybe is presented in gallery settings or in festival settings, and is less kind of easily put into either dance or theatre. So she sort of sits across our 2 teams. But yeah, I mean, it's a great team. I feel very lucky to get to work with them, and we have a nice kind of complement of experience. So both Lulu and Emily trained as dancers, so they have that kind of very practical dance training that I don't have, and they have kind of different sorts of experience than me. So Emily, for example, worked in vocational training and education quite a lot, and she's also worked in dance and health, which I haven't. So that's really complementary. Lulu's been working in Scotland for a really long time, a lot longer than either of us. So she has that kind of real grounding of knowledge of the Scottish context, as well as that kind of deep history of dance in Scotland. So I think we're really complementary as a team, and it's quite nice, it being quite a small team, is that we're quite close, and we speak nearly every day, and it's especially at the moment, and yeah. So I guess going on to the second part of your question around what a typical day is, there will usually be a check-in of the 3 or 4 of us, just to see what each of us are working on that day, and to see what whether the conversations that each of us have been having have brought anything up that we need to look at. We each hold slightly different relationships. So, as I say, Emily has a lot of relationships with the education sector, who has relationships with different parts of the geography of Scotland, and with kind of rural touring scene. I have sort of slightly different relationships with sort of more UK networks, so we kind of check in around some of those things as well. Then most days will involve something to do with a grant application. We get we get those in all the time. It's as I'm sure you know, the Open Fund is a kind of rolling program, so applications come in on a daily basis. So most days we'll be either doing some assessing of a grant application, or one of us might be on a funding panel. We have funding panels every week, so usually one of us will be on a funding panel most weeks. So we'll be kind of reading all the applications that will be going to that funding panel, or dealing with the feedback after the funding panel. So that's quite a big job. We'll be talking to our regularly funded organisations and checking in with them probably. We have lots of other funding programmes that happen at different points in the year. So the Touring Fund, or the Create Inclusion Fund, which is a fund for focusing on diversity. Then at the moment we're doing a lot of kind of coronavirus related things. So collating kind of guidance from everywhere and feeding that back to the organisations and artists that we work with. Talking to various kind of national or international groups around kind of best practice at the moment. Supporting organisations to adapt their work. So yeah, those are some of the things that we would be doing. In happier times, we would also maybe get to see some dance, but there's not so much of that at the moment. But yeah, we normally try and see some dance at some point in the week. And there's a lot of internal meetings. So there's a lot of kind of meetings with colleagues around different policy areas, or different kind of areas of our work. So that's a big part of our day as well.
Yeah, and of course you have the open funding and the touring fund, which are open throughout the whole year. So that keeps you busy from week to week, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Speaking about dance, how would you characterize the dance sector in Scotland? Well, in Edinburgh, since we're based in Edinburgh, actually. And what are some of the challenges that the sector faces?
Okay. I mean, yeah, dance sector in Scotland. I think it's quite a small sector compared to other art forms. But that size is a positive, as well as I mean, I think sometimes it can be negative, because sometimes it's one of the art forms that's maybe lower down people's awareness in terms of the work that's going on. But I work hard to make sure that's not the case. But I think the great advantage of that scale is that it's very supportive and collaborative. So everyone knows everyone else pretty much. And they're very supportive of each other, and there's not a kind of sense in some of the bigger art forms of that kind of competition. I think people are generally a bit more collaborative in the dance sector, and I think it certainly punches above its weight in terms of its visibility internationally. I think it's quite internationally focused. So I think Scotland as a country generally is always looking outward. And I think in terms of the arts sector, and I think the dance sector is very typical of that. I think it's always kind of looking to collaborate with other countries, or to think about touring to other countries. I think the work is deeply thoughtful. I think, again, maybe there's something around the culture within Scotland that I think people who are making dance here are making it from a real genuine intention, rather than just wanting to make something that looks nice,
Yeah.
and that's really that's. I guess that maybe touches on some of the challenges, because I think maybe that's part of the reason for that, is that you have to really want to be a dance artist here, because it's hard. It's there's not loads of money, and there's less work around because of the size of the sector than there are in other places. So it's hard to kind of really maintain that career and to kind of maintain a regularity of work and employment. And I guess that also ties into one of the other challenges, which is around retaining talent here. So so sometimes younger artists might leave Scotland because they see that there's more opportunities elsewhere. So that's a real challenge for us, is to kind of really keep people here and to create better conditions for people, so that there is a way of really sustaining a career up here. And in terms of the sector in Edinburgh, I think one of the challenges is maybe there isn't as many programming opportunities. There isn't as many opportunities to present work in Edinburgh as there are in other places. Maybe in Glasgow, for example, there's maybe a few more opportunities to present your work, and still not loads. So I think that there's a bit of a kind of imbalance there that again is something that we're talking as a sector about how we can address. But I think that having more opportunities for people to see dance work, and for more opportunities for dance artists to present their work in Edinburgh would be really positive, and that's something I'd really like to see. And then I guess tied into that is we don't have loads of spaces for dance artists to work in. Dance
I was going to mention that.
So dance is one of those art forms, and it's been particularly apparent in lockdown, when people have not been able to use those few spaces that there are, that dance really needs dedicated space to make
spaces.
That maybe as a writer or as a musician you don't necessarily need, but we really do. We need spaces of scale. We need spun floors often, and there's not loads of those in Scotland. The dance space in Edinburgh, we're really lucky, is the only kind of specially made dance
venue for that
venue. And it's incredible, but it's one space. There are other kind of spaces dotted around, and a space like the studio that the Workroom have in Tramway in Glasgow is amazing, but it's one studio. So I think there's certainly an imbalance between the number of artists there are in Scotland and the amount of space that's available to them. So again, that's something that we're looking at how we can address as a sector.
Yeah. Well, this probably answers a bit of the next question, but we already kind of started speaking about it. How has the infrastructure for dance improved in Scotland in the past few years, and how must it still improve to create more opportunities for people across Scotland to access world-class dance as participants and audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been really apparent in this current coronavirus situation is that the infrastructure for all art forms is really fragile, and I think we might look at another art form and say, oh, they've got a much better infrastructure than us, but actually all of the infrastructures for all the art forms are fairly fragile, and it just needs one organisation to close, and there's a whole kind of area of the country that's not served. So that's a real challenge. I think in that respect, I think it has improved over recent years for dance. I mean, just in the 2 years that I've been working here, I think I've seen that thing of the geographic provision improve. So there's more access to dance no matter where you are in the country, and things like Dance North up in Findhorn. They became a regularly funded organisation a couple of years ago, and have really kind of grown their programme and their programmes of work across Moray and the Highlands, and that's really provided much more opportunity for people to engage with dance up there. But then there are kind of lots of areas of the country where there's really small organisations really trying to kind of deliver dance work on very little resource. That it's really hard for them, and for dance, I think what's really apparent is that we're an art form where the infrastructure is really reliant on a few people. We don't have an infrastructure of lots of venues. We have an infrastructure of lots of people, and if that person is not able to work or that person decides to move, then there's a whole gap of dance in a particular area. So that's something that as a sector, the dance community has been looking at. So the dance community has been trying to set up a kind of network of people who work in dance development across the country to support them more with more kind of professional development or more kind of peer support. And that's something that we're kind of continuing to work with them on. But yeah, I think that geographic provision, there's still more that we need to do. I think there's still more that we need to do around the diversity of dance that's being supported in Scotland as well.
Yeah.
I think the range of dance forms that people can engage in is really limited in lots of places. We're really lucky that in Scotland, dance is a hugely participated in activity through things like Ceilidh dance and country dancing, and those are things that kind of exist in lots of places, but there's not necessarily that range of different dance forms for people to engage in all parts of Scotland, and that's something we really want to really grow if possible.
Do you feel that there's more focus on dance for children and young people rather than adults?
Yeah, I think that's probably true everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is that you talked about you used the words world class there, and I think one of the areas where Scotland's practice in both theatre and dance is world class is around work for young audiences. I think we make some really brilliant dance for young audiences through companies like Curious Seed or Balban Ballet. And that's been kind of really successful over the years. I think there is some really strong participation work for adults happening across the country. There's some really great work happening for older people, and for people with particular needs. So there's a really great Dance for Parkinson's project that was initiated by Dance Space and Scottish Ballet, and happens across Scotland through a network that they oversee, and that's really positive, and that's provided huge opportunities for people with Parkinson's to engage with dance activity that has both a kind of a social and recreational benefit, but also a health benefit. So that's been really positive.
No, that's fantastic to see all this initiative actually it's inclusive, it's not just focusing on just certain people, targeting certain people, but including everyone, which is very important.
Yeah, and we're really lucky. I mean, and just going back to your question about world-class dance, I think we're really lucky that there are some really world-class dance artists in Scotland, and they're touring in Scotland so people can see their work. And I think maybe in terms of world-class dance from other places coming to Scotland, we have a bit less of that, and that's certainly something we could work on, because I think it's really important for those artists making in Scotland that they see other work.
To see other work, yeah.
Yeah.
But this goes back to the venues problem, probably, right?
Yeah, and there are some really, there's really great work going on. Tramway have a fantastic festival called Dance International Glasgow. There's a great festival called Dance Live that happens in Aberdeen, and some of those festivals are really trying to bring that work into Scotland. But yeah, there's always more that we can do. So
of course.
So yeah.
Well, many have opted now to go online, also because of the current situation. Did you see much more of an interest from artists to create work to go online, especially in using well-known platforms such as Instagram or Facebook? If so, what is the change, and do you think that this is positive or negative?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been some. I think everyone kind of looked at online immediately as a kind of way of continuing to work. I think it's difficult for dance for some of the reasons we talked about earlier around the need for particular facilities or space. It's harder to do dance in your in your front room.
Yes, of
than
course.
it is
I
for
spoke
some
with
other art forms.
dancers and they were all like, "Ah, I can't wait to go back to my dancing studio because I can't
Yeah.
practice," which is unfortunate, eh?
Yeah, and I think also just there's something about the motivations you have to work in dance tend to be about kind of wanting to work with other people, and dance is an art form that relies on collaboration and touch and all these things that are not possible at the moment, and that's difficult for artists.
Yeah.
But there's been some really brilliant online classes happening. I think most of the dance organisations in Scotland have been delivering online classes, whether that's Dance Face in Edinburgh or Dance North or City Moves in Aberdeen, and that's been really fantastic. There's been some kind of more kind of social dance things happening. So there's an artist called Emma Jane Park who's been running a thing called Daily Dancing, which is just little 10-minute dance sessions every morning, and she's been doing that for the last sort of 3 months, I think. Wow. Pretty much every day. It's incredible, and that's been really positive. But I think there's been less kind of performance work made. I think for some of the reasons I just talked about, but also I think dance can take slightly longer to make. It's a particular skill, filming dance, that's not necessarily available to everybody. So I think the ones that we have seen going online are either particular projects that have come up for people during this time. So there's been a really beautiful pieces of online work from Jack Webb, who's a dance artist based in Edinburgh, and an artist called Abby Watson has also made a really beautiful piece. She's based in Glasgow, so that's been really positive. But then there's also been a strand of artists who predominantly make work for the screen. There's a genre of dance called screen dance that's actually quite established in Scotland. There's some really established artists working here. So for them, sharing that work online has been a bit straightforward.
Easier.
Yeah,
because they have the right equipment, which makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So they're used to their work being seen in that way. Whereas I think as an audience member, it's not necessarily the best way always to see dance as well, because you kind of like, I want to see what's happening, what the feet doing, or what I can't see everything. So that can be frustrating.
It's quite a personal choice. Yeah, it is.
But it encourages different ways of thinking about things, and there's been one of the, I think for all of us at Great Scotland, I think one of the really inspiring things in this period has been seeing the range of creative responses to this new way of life, and people kind of really having different ideas about how they can work in this new way. But I think ultimately for lots of people's work, it relies on liveness. It relies on a physical connection with an audience. So equally, it's entirely right that some people just are not making at the moment, and they're using this time to maybe think about what they can do when they are back in the studio.
I'll be asking you some questions about funding. However, have they been applying for funding to create work online?
Yeah. So people have been doing that.
There've been interest.
Yeah, and that's something we made some quite quick changes to our funding when the lockdown first happened, and one of those was around making it, or trying to make our criteria more open to sharing work in a different way. Because previously we had a whole section of our funding applications that was about reaching people, and obviously reaching people is slightly different in this time. You can't physically reach people, so we've tried to allow for more creative ways of finding audiences. So we've had some really interesting applications come in that are approaching that way of reaching audiences online.
That's great. Going forward in the coming months, then, what is Creative Scotland's role, and how are you getting involved in that?
So I think simply our role over the coming period is to support the sector to survive, and to and to adapt to the new ways of working that it needs to that it might need to adopt in this changing environment. So, I mean, it's pretty clear, I guess, that the sector's not going to be fully up and running anytime soon, but there might be a kind of gradual change in how people work. So it's supporting. We need to kind of adapt our systems and our processes and our ways of communicating to that kind of constantly changing scenario, and ensure that we're supporting people as they need to be supported in that moment. So partly that's around supporting people who already have money from us, like the regularly funded organisations, to adapt their work and to try and give enough flexibility as possible for them to change what their plans were. And that's the same for people who maybe have had an Open Funds award or Touring Funds award, and then have had to change that. And then we've been trying to, as I say, we've been trying to adapt some of our funding programs. So we had some very quick turnaround funding in the initial lockdown period that was about supporting kind of freelancers who'd lost money as a result of the COVID crisis. And then we tried to make some changes to our open funds to again be a bit more suited to the current situation. We're kind of constantly updating that. So that's something that I'm personally quite preoccupied with at the moment. Is just ensuring that those changes we made are still relevant. That how can we make it better suited to people? How can we kind of clarify some of the things that people are maybe a bit confused about? I think one of the things that we've found is that this period has meant that a lot more people are looking to Creative Scotland for support than maybe were before, just because there's a real need out there for the huge range of people in the sector. I mean, there's 16,000 creative businesses in Scotland. And lots of those never came to us for support, but because they were kind of they were working in kind of commercial markets. But I think all of them now their work suddenly stopped, and they're all looking for support in some way or another. So that's something that we're thinking about, is how we can support that, or if we can't support them, how we're making it clear where they can maybe access other support. And one of the main things we're doing as well is advocating to Scottish Government for more support, both Scottish Government and the UK Government actually, to try and, because at the moment what we've been able to do is just redirect the funding we already had to be available to people. What we really need, I think what the sector really needs, is maybe some additional support to make up for this huge lack of income that they've had over this period. Of course. I mean, so many of those theatres and organisations rely mostly on the earned income from people buying tickets, not on Creative Scotland's funding. So without that, they're really struggling, and that's the same for individual artists who, it all trickles down. So if big venues are suffering, then smaller organisations are suffering, and individual artists are suffering. So we really need additional support to
support.
To keep that going. And then I guess longer term, we're thinking about how we might support the sector to recover after this, and support the sector to maybe use this moment of reset to think about how it can recover in a way that creates more opportunities for people, or creates a fairer working environment for the range of people in the sector, and can create more opportunities for more people. So there's a kind of immediate need thing that we're dealing with. There's a kind of mid-term kind of supporting the sector to recover and have more resources, and then there's a longer term kind of how can we recover in a more positive way thing that we're also working on.
I'm not going to ask you to talk me through the benefits that practitioners and organizations can benefit from, because they can find these things online, and you already kind of spoke a bit about it. But what kind of approach should creators take when applying for public funding?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I think I always say to people when they ask that question, I should say that, that's something that maybe should have said this in the kind of what's a typical day look like, but we do talk to artists and organizations about funding applications a lot. And we're really available to that. So people should feel absolutely free to get in touch with us, and we can help. And we can help talk people through through funding, so they shouldn't feel like we're not available for that. But when people do ask me for kind of advice, I mean, my kind of top level thing that I always say is that a good application tells a story. So it tells the story of what you want to do and why you want to do it, why you want to do it now, who else is involved, why they're involved, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it like that. So all those kind of things, it's kind of a story that needs to have a sort of beginning. This is what my idea, this is how I want to do it, and this is why I want to do it. The middle, and this is how it's going to happen, and this is what's going to happen, the stages that are going to happen within it. And then an ending, which is kind of what's going to be different at the end of it. How are people going to feel different? How's the world going to look different? What's the project going to look like at the end? And I think the best funding applications really tell that story and make it really clear why it's happening, what's going to happen, and what's going to be different at the end. And so that's kind of something that I encourage people to really think about when they're writing the application is, and get other people to read it. People who maybe don't know anything about your practice. That's really helpful. But as I say, and use us. That's what we're here for, is to help people apply to us. We see applications every day, so we see the kind of some of the common kind of pitfalls that people fall into, and we can kind of help you to avoid those.
Sometimes people I myself do tend to write stuff and just not show it to anyone. I think it's important to share work before actually applying. There's no harm into sharing and getting the opinion about what you've been working on, because it's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really
and I think
helpful.
I think often people feel the pressure to write lots and lots and lots as well, and that's not necessarily always helpful. So I think, again, that's something that sometimes some people could say to sharing it with someone else can help you sort of pare it down to the kind of to make it really clear what you're trying to do and why. I guess the thing that I should say, and we always say, is that the competition is really high, and we get way more applications that we want to support than we can support. And I know I said that earlier as well, but I think it's something that bears repeating, because it's I think that's the really hard bit of our job, is that we know that every application is part of your soul as an artist. And I've been on the other side. I've spent most of my career doing the applying bit rather than the assessing bit. So I understand it. And you put your heart and soul into an application, and then when you hear that it's not being awarded, you feel like you've been rejected, and we know that, and we feel that, if we all wish that we had more money and we could support more things, and that's something we're always doing, is advocating the Scottish Government that if they just gave us a bit more money, we could support so much more brilliant creativity in the country. But when we're having to make those tough decisions, because it is public money, we're thinking about, I guess that's something to maybe note in this question, is that we're thinking about not only what's a compelling idea, but why is it important? Why is it important to the artists that are involved? Why is it important to the people who are going to experience it as participants or as audiences? And why is it important for those people that it happens right now?
Of course.
So those are things that I keep coming back to with people.
Yeah. Okay. The last few questions, the last 4 questions, are asked to each and every participant.
Okay.
So, what do you wish you had known when you had started working in the industry?
Okay. I think I think there's a couple of things. I think there's things that you maybe are about the industry, and things that are maybe just about what I wish I'd known in life generally. I think in life generally, I think it's when you're starting out in an industry, you think, you make plans and you make kind of, this kind of mental thing of, oh, I want to be here by then, or I want to be there by then.
Yeah.
And when I'm this age, I'll be running a big organization. And that was one of the things that I wish I'd known, that it doesn't work. And you have lots of sideways steps, and things go in different directions. And, I've had some very sideways steps and some very odd moves. And I've had, years in my 40s where I was earning less than I earned in my 20s. And, it's not all kind of a nice, neat upward trajectory.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of the industry, I think, I think in general, I've had a really positive experience working. I've been really lucky. I've had a really positive experience of working in the arts, and in arts especially. I think people are really kind, and and that's been, I think, asking for help, or asking when you say you don't know something, people are there to support you, and I've found that really kind of positive. And again, I think maybe that's something I wish I'd known, is that you don't always have to know everything. And actually, by not knowing things, often that opens opportunities for more interesting discussions. Just by saying, I don't know about this, can you tell me more about it? Is a really nice way of opening a discussion that maybe leads your thinking in a slightly different direction. And that's been really, and I've really enjoyed that. I think I've become probably more open to doing that as I've got older. I've been more open to being honest about when I don't know something, or when I feel someone else has more knowledge about something, and looking to them to speak. And generally, I'm someone who just likes to sort of sit back and listen rather than do all the talking. So this is quite a challenge.
Yeah. It's funny you're saying that, because others mentioned that, and I think it's because many fear to ask questions and to actually show that they're kind of wrong about something, and we have all this fear. But many mentioned that, and I think it's a very important point. It's a very relevant point.
Yeah. And I think as a sector, we probably could do more around, I think, thinking about that, I mean, that's a very personal thing, but I think if you think about it more globally, then I think, as a sector, we maybe should be thinking about that when we think about how we talk to audiences and participants who aren't involved in our sector and who aren't involved in the arts generally. I think it can be quite intimidating for people.
Yeah.
And I think we don't necessarily always talk about dance or any of the art forms in a way that's understanding where people are coming from, or that's kind of welcoming or encouraging. I think on a slight, I've said lots of very positive things, but I think on a slightly more negative thing, I think we could be more creative as a sector. I think we're still kind of, for a creative sector, we often don't work in very creative ways. I think often we're kind of working in slightly outdated models, or kind of when we think about how we recruit people, or how we kind of work with people, they're still quite hierarchical. They're still quite kind of based on models from the 50s. They're still kind of, it's a pretty, monocultural and hierarchical sector that we work in. And I think, there's absolutely a need to be better around those things.
I feel that there are so many business models that really work out there from different sectors, different industries. And I think it will be good to actually have a look at them, because I totally agree with you on that. That I feel that the creative sector, unfortunately, will still follow a very old model on how to manage business. And I think now it's there again. Before it was more leisure, now it's business and leisure rather than just leisure. So I think that is one of the negative things, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
True.
Politically, I'm very kind of, with a small p, I'm very, always trying to think of ways that we can work we can encourage organisations to work in ways that are less hierarchical and more kind of collaborative, and less built around a particular kind of capitalist kind of model of working, because I think that's one of the beautiful things about the arts and creativity, is that it doesn't need to work in the same way as other organisations or other sectors.
Yeah. So you kind of already answered this. What would you tell people who aspire to work as a public in the public funding sector, actually?
Okay, and that's a good question. I think it's
because I also feel that it's not something that you're born and you think you're going to end up doing that. As
no,
you said,
I don't think anyone does that.
You end up taking different paths and you end up doing it just because of the previous experiences that you have. So what would you suggest to people who are actually aspiring to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's many people out there who think, I really want to work for Creative Scotland, but I think, but yeah, and I've joked with friends before that I think it should be like jury service. I think everyone should have to work for a funder for 6 months just to understand
what it's
like. Because it can sometimes be pretty thankless, and it can be, you're maybe sometimes seen as the person who doesn't give the funding rather than the person who does. And some of those difficult decisions you have to make, where you're kind of having to tell someone whose work you think is brilliant that they haven't received their funding is pretty tough. So you have to be quite resilient in that way. But it's also, I feel incredibly lucky. I get to work with this whole amazing sector in Scotland. I get this amazing kind of bird's eye view of all the creativity that's happening in Scotland. I get to kind of work with these amazing set of colleagues who are all incredibly passionate about the sectors they work in. And you see all the great activity that's happening in their sectors, and maybe can bring some bits from, there's this amazing project happening in music. I want to kind of take some of the learning from that and share it with some of the dance world. So you get this incredible kind of overview of the incredible range of creativity that's happening in Scotland, which is really inspiring, and it gives you that kind of inspiration every day. And yeah, I mean, it's a really nice place to work. People are really kind and friendly, and yeah, I think although I think throughout my working life, at various points, there's been a kind of let's abolish the arts councils, or let's abolish Creative Scotland and do something different. And I think every that comes up all the time. But I think whenever you actually have that conversation in a bit more depth, you end up with something that looks very similar to the structure that we have, which is, people who've worked in the sector going into the funding body to make kind of decisions from a position of understanding the sector. And that's kind of, there are definitely ways we could work more collaboratively with the sector, and I'm really passionate that we try and find those ways. But I think fundamentally, the way it's set up is probably imbalanced. That, at its heart, it's the right sort of model. I think we just need more money, and we need to find ways of working more collaboratively with the sector so we can support more activity.
Definitely. Okay, last 2 questions. If you could have lunch with one creative alive or dead, who would that be?
Oh, that's a really difficult one. I think if I was being really honest, it probably wouldn't be a dance person.
That's fine.
Because I think it would probably, well, I think one of my favourite writers is a writer called Rebecca Solnit. So I think it would probably be her, because I find her work constantly kind of inspiring and what's the word? It's necessary. Just it's kind of really helpful to my daily life. She has she writes lots of essays and non-fiction work. She has a book called Hope in the Dark, which is about how you find hope in at times of crisis, which I find really I find really helpful in
enough.
this period. So probably her. And then I'd probably have to have someone else as well, because, you know, as I said, I like hearing conversations rather than necessarily being the one speaking all the time. So I'd probably want to have a musician in there. So I'd probably be, and, you know, thinking about my previous life, it'd probably be someone from the hip hop world. So maybe like Jean Grey, who's an American rapper, or Erykah Badu, or someone like that, because that's the sort of music that I'm very passionate about. So I think that would be a pretty good dinner party.
Good. Describe arts and culture in 3 words.
Vital, nourishing, and inspiring.
Fantastic. 3 lovely words, actually. Paul, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. I hope many will find it very interesting to listen to your perspective about the industry, and also like working with Creative Scotland just gives us an overview of how life is and what you have to do, what your work involves. Would you like to add something else?
No, just to say thank you to you. It's a really lovely way to start the day, with a kind of perspective on what I do, and perspective on and reminded me of all the kind of wonderful reasons that I do the job I do. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul, and speak soon.